Jason stood in the middle of our living room, arms crossed, his face set in that expression I'd learned meant he'd made up his mind about something. The afternoon sun filtered through the windows I'd chosen, in the house I'd bought 3 years before I even met him. "Pack a bag, Lauren," he said, his voice cold and final. "This is my house now. You need to leave." I looked at him carefully, keeping my face neutral. We'd been married for 4 years, and I'd seen him angry before, but this was different. This was calculated. Rehearsed, even. "Jason, this isn't your house," I said calmly. "You know that." He pulled out his phone, already dialing. "We'll see what the police have to say about that. You're refusing to leave my property." I watched him dial 911, that smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. He thought he had me cornered. He thought confidence and volume would somehow change reality, would rewrite the deed sitting in my safe upstairs. "Yes, I need police assistance," he said into the phone, his eyes locked on mine. "My wife is refusing to leave my home. I've asked her repeatedly, and she's becoming hostile." I said nothing. I didn't argue or plead or defend myself. I simply turned and walked upstairs to my home office, opened the safe, and pulled out a folder I'd prepared months ago just in case. Police would be here in minutes. And Jason had no idea what was about to happen. The knock came exactly 12 minutes later. 2 officers stood on the porch, a tall woman with kind eyes and a younger male officer with a notepad already out. Jason rushed to answer the door, his voice taking on that tone he used when he wanted to sound reasonable and victimized. "Thank you for coming so quickly. My wife and I are having a dispute about the property, and she's refusing to vacate." The female officer looked past Jason to where I stood calmly in the hallway, the folder tucked under my arm. "Ma'am, can you tell us your side?" "This is my house," I said simply. "I purchased it 3 years before we married. It's in my name only." Jason scoffed, that confident smirk still on his face. "Officers, we're married. This is marital property. We both own it." The male officer looked between us. "Do you have documentation of ownership?" I stepped forward and handed the folder to the female officer. Inside was the original deed showing my name, Lauren Whitmore, as the sole owner. Purchase date, 7 years ago. My signature. No one else's. The officers examined the document carefully. I watched their body language shift, saw them exchange a glance. The female officer looked up at Jason, and her tone changed completely. "Sir, according to this deed, the property belongs solely to Ms. Whitmore. Your name doesn't appear anywhere on this document." Jason's smirk faltered. There must be a mistake. We're married. It's our house." "Marriage doesn't automatically transfer property ownership," the male officer said, his voice professional but firm. "If her name is the only one on the deed, she's the legal owner." I watched Jason's face as the reality sank in. Color drained from his cheeks. His hands, so confident moments ago when he'd been dialing the police, now hung uselessly at his sides. The female officer turned to me. "Ma'am, given that you're the property owner, would you like us to remove him from the premises?" Jason's eyes went wide. For the first time since this confrontation began, he looked genuinely unsure of himself. Wait, he said, attempting to laugh, his hands raised in a gesture that was supposed to look casual but came off as desperate. "This is all a big misunderstanding. I didn't mean. I thought we were both on the deed. I must have been confused." The female officer looked at him with an expression I recognized, the one people get when they realize someone has been wasting their time. "Sir, you called us here claiming she was trespassing in your home. That's a serious accusation. I was just upset. Couples fight, you know? We had an argument and I overreacted. I apologize for wasting your time." The male officer closed his notepad. "If tensions are high between you two, it might be best if you leave the property for a few hours. Let things cool down." Jason looked at me, then at the officers, then back at me. I could see him recalculating, trying to figure out how to salvage this situation. But there was nothing to salvage. He called the police to kick me out of my own home, and instead they were suggesting he leave. "That won't be necessary," Jason said stiffly. "I'll just go upstairs." After the officers left, giving me their card and telling me to call if I felt unsafe, the house fell into heavy silence. Jason stood in the entryway, his jaw clenched, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. Then he turned to me, and his voice dropped to something quiet and dangerous. "You'll regret embarrassing me like that." He walked upstairs without waiting for a response. I heard the guest bedroom door slam. That night, I locked my bedroom door for the first time in our marriage. I lay in bed that night, unable to sleep, my mind racing through the events of the day. Jason's threat echoed in my head. "You'll regret embarrassing me." It wasn't the words themselves that scared me. It was the coldness in his voice when he said them. Calculation. Like he'd already started planning his next move. I found myself replaying the last 6 months in my head, looking for the warning signs I'd missed or ignored. How had we gotten here? When had my husband decided that intimidation and police calls were appropriate ways to handle a marriage? The answer, I realized, was that this hadn't come out of nowhere. There had been signs. Pressure. Subtle manipulations I'd brushed off as stress or miscommunication. I thought about the prenup we'd signed before getting married. My attorney had insisted on it, given that I already owned property and had significant assets. Jason had signed it without complaint, saying he understood and respected my financial independence. Had he signed it thinking he'd find a way around it later? Had this always been part of some long-term plan? I stared at the ceiling, listening to the silence of my house. The house I'd worked so hard to buy, the house I'd loved before Jason ever entered my life. Tomorrow I'd start documenting everything. Tomorrow I'd start preparing for whatever came next. 'Cause Jason's threat wasn't empty. I knew him well enough to know that. The memories came flooding back as I lay there in the dark. 6 months ago, Jason had started pushing me to refinance the house. He'd brought it up casually at first, over dinner one evening. "You know, with interest rates dropping, we should really look into refinancing," he'd said, cutting into his steak. "We could save a lot of money on the monthly payments." "I'm comfortable with my current mortgage," I'd replied. "The rate is already pretty good. But if we refinance jointly, we get even better terms. Plus it makes sense, right? We're married. Why wouldn't you want both our names on the house?" There it was. The real reason. Not better interest rates. He wanted his name on my deed. "Jason, we talked about this before we got married. Prenup specifically protects premarital assets. The house stays in my name." He'd smiled then, but it hadn't reached his eyes. "I'm not trying to take your house, Lauren. I just want us to be equal partners. Doesn't it seem weird to you that you own the house and I'm just living here? You're not just living here. This is your home too. But legally, the property is mine. That was part of our agreement." He'd dropped it that night, but he kept bringing it up. In different ways at different times. Always with that same undertone of, "Don't you trust me?" It had made me feel guilty. Like I was being paranoid or unfair. Like I was treating my husband like a stranger instead of my partner. But I'd held firm. Something in my gut told me not to budge on this, no matter how much he pushed. Now, lying in bed with my door locked, I was grateful I'd listened to that instinct. 2 months before Jason's police stunt, I'd found something that changed everything. I'd been looking for our tax documents in Jason's home office, the spare bedroom he used for work. I'd opened the drawer where he usually kept important papers, and there, tucked under a stack of old bills, was an envelope from a bank I didn't recognize. Curiosity had gotten the better of me. I'd pulled it out and opened it. It was a pre-qualification letter for a home equity line of credit. In Jason's name. Using my house, my address, my property as collateral. The letter was dated 3 weeks earlier. My hands had started shaking as I read it. He'd applied for a line of credit against property he didn't own. He'd listed himself as the homeowner on the application. And he'd never said a word to me about it. I'd taken a photo of the letter with my phone, put it back exactly where I'd found it, and spent the next hour sitting in my car in the driveway trying to process what I'd discovered. This wasn't just financial ignorance. This wasn't a misunderstanding about marital property. This was Jason deliberately trying to leverage my house for his own purposes. Without my knowledge. Without my signature. Without my consent. The bank would never approve it, of course. He'd need my signature for anything involving the property. But the fact that he'd tried, that he'd lied on the application, that he'd gone behind my back, that's when I'd realized I needed to protect myself. That's when I'd started building my case. The day after finding that pre-qualification letter, I'd called a real estate attorney. Not our family lawyer, not anyone Jason knew. A specialist recommended by a colleague at work. I'd sat in her office, a woman named Patricia Donovan with sharp eyes and 2 decades of experience, and laid out everything. The house I'd bought before marriage. Prenup. Jason's pressure to refinance. And finally, the bank letter. Patricia had listened without interrupting, taking notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, she'd looked up at me with an expression that was both sympathetic and grimly determined. "Without your signature, your husband has no legal claim to the property," she'd said. "The prenup makes that crystal clear. Premarital assets remain separate property." But what about him trying to get the line of credit? Is that legal? Attempting to secure a loan using property you don't own, and misrepresenting yourself as the owner on the application? That's fraud. It's serious. The word had hit me like a physical blow. Fraud. My husband had committed fraud. What should I do? I'd asked. Document everything. Every conversation about the house. Every financial transaction. Every attempt he makes to access or control the property. Keep copies of that bank letter. If he tries to file any liens or claims against the house, you'll need a paper trail. I'd left her office with a plan. And I'd started building my evidence that very day. A week after finding the pre-qualification letter, I'd noticed something strange in our joint checking account. We kept separate finances mostly, but we had one shared account we used for household expenses and utilities. Large sums had been transferred out. $5,000 here. $3,000 there. All going into Jason's personal account. The timing was suspicious. Right after I'd refused to refinance, the transfers had started. I downloaded every statement going back 2 years. Created a spreadsheet tracking every deposit and withdrawal. Pattern was clear. Jason had been systematically moving money out of our joint account and into his personal account. Money that was supposed to be for our shared expenses. When I'd asked him about it casually, he'd waved it off. Just moving some money around for a business investment opportunity. I'll put it back. He never put it back. I'd added it all to my growing file. The bank letter. Transfer history. Screenshots of every text message where he'd pressured me about refinancing. Emails from real estate agents he'd contacted without telling me, asking about property valuations. He was building a case for why he deserved half the house. I was building a case for why he deserved nothing. 3 weeks before the police incident, Jason had started a smear campaign among our friends. I'd first noticed it when my friend Alicia had called, her voice careful and concerned. "Hey, I just wanted to check in on you. Jason mentioned you've been really stressed lately. Is everything okay?" "I'm fine," I'd said, confused. Why would Jason say I'm stressed? He seemed worried about you. Said you've been acting kind of erratic. Erratic. That was the word he was using. Mentally unstable. Unpredictable. Over the next few weeks, more friends reached out with the same careful concern. Jason had been telling people I'd called the police on him, which wasn't true. He'd called them himself. That I was being irrational about finances. that he was worried about my mental state. He was laying groundwork, setting up a narrative where I was the unstable one, the unreasonable one, so that when he made his move, whatever that move was going to be, people would believe his version of events. I didn't defend myself publicly. I didn't call people to give my side of the story. I just noted who was reaching out, what they'd been told, and added it to my documentation. But one friend, Nathan, who'd known me since college, had forwarded me screenshots of texts Jason had sent him. And those texts changed everything. The screenshots from Nathan were damning. Jason had been far more honest with Nathan than he'd been with our other friends, probably because he thought Nathan would be sympathetic to guy talk about marriage problems. "I'll have the house in 6 months," one text read. "Lauren thinks she's so smart with her prenup, but she doesn't understand how marital property works. Once I establish residency and contribution to the household, I'll have a strong case for equity." Another text: "She's being stubborn about refinancing, but I've got other ways to establish my claim. Patience and documentation." And the most chilling one: "If intimidation doesn't work, I'll go legal. But honestly, I think she'll fold once she realizes fighting me will be expensive and exhausting." Nathan had sent them to me with a simple message: "Thought you should see these. This isn't okay." I'd sat staring at those texts for a long time. Jason had planned this. He'd strategized about how to take my house. He'd calculated different approaches: intimidation, legal action, social pressure. And he genuinely believed he would win. I'd saved the screenshots to my encrypted cloud storage, added them to my physical folder, and made a decision: I wouldn't confront him. I wouldn't warn him that I knew about his plan. I would just let him continue believing he was smarter than me. And I would keep gathering evidence. On my attorney's advice, I'd separated our finances 2 weeks before Jason's police stunt. I'd gone to the bank and converted our joint account to one that required both signatures for any withdrawals over $500. Jason had noticed immediately. He'd come home from work, his face red with anger, waving his phone at me. "What did you do to our account?" "I tried to transfer money and it was blocked." "I added dual signature requirements," I'd said calmly, "for our protection, so neither of us can make large withdrawals without the other knowing." "That's not protection, that's control. You're trying to trap my money." "It's a joint account, Jason. The money belongs to both of us. This just ensures we both agree on how it's used." He'd pace the living room like a caged animal. "This is insane. You're being paranoid and controlling. First you won't refinance, now you're locking down our accounts. What's next, Lauren?" "I'm just protecting our shared assets," I'd said, keeping my voice level. "If you have a problem with that, maybe we need to talk about why you need such easy access to our money." That's when he'd threatened divorce for the first time. "You know what? Maybe we should just end this. If you can't trust me, if you're going to treat me like some kind of criminal, maybe we're not meant to be married." "Maybe you're right," I'd said quietly. He'd looked shocked that I hadn't begged him to reconsider. He'd expected me to back down, to apologize, to remove the restrictions to save our marriage. Instead, I'd called his bluff. The next day, I'd gone to Patricia's office and filed for divorce. Not because I was angry or impulsive, but because Jason had shown me exactly who he was. And I'd gathered enough evidence to protect myself. Petitions cited financial misconduct and attempted coercion. I'd attached copies of the fraudulent loan application, the bank transfer records, and the text messages where Jason discussed his plan to take my house. Tricia had filed everything with the court. Jason was served with the papers at his workplace, in front of his colleagues. The change in his tone had been immediate and dramatic. He called me that afternoon, his voice completely different from the angry man who'd threatened divorce the day before. "Lauren, what are you doing? You filed for divorce? We can work this out. You told me yesterday that maybe we should end this," I'd said calmly. "I'm just following through on your suggestion. I didn't mean it. I was upset. You can't just file for divorce over one argument. This isn't about one argument, Jason. This is about a pattern of financial manipulation, attempted fraud, and your stated plan to take property that doesn't belong to you. Silence on the other end. Then, what plan? What are you talking about? I have the texts you sent to Nathan. I have the loan application. I have the bank records. I have everything. More silence. I could almost hear him recalculating, realizing that I'd been several steps ahead of him this entire time. We need to talk, he'd said finally. In person. Without lawyers. Talk to my attorney, I'd said and hung up. Over the next 2 weeks, Jason had launched a new campaign. He'd started telling people he'd sacrificed his career for me, that he'd moved to this city for my job, that he'd been the primary financial contributor to our household. The narrative spread through our social circle. Jason, the devoted husband who'd given up everything, being unfairly kicked out by his cold, calculating wife who wouldn't even share her house with him. I'd heard the whispers, seen the looks. Some friends had stopped calling altogether, clearly having chosen sides. But I had receipts. Literally. I'd pulled every mortgage statement since I'd bought the house 7 years ago. Every single payment had come from my account. Every property tax bill. Every insurance payment. Every repair and renovation. Jason's contributions to the household? He'd paid for groceries sometimes. Split utilities. But the house itself? The mortgage, the maintenance, the significant expenses? All me. I'd created a detailed financial breakdown, organized by year. It was devastating in its clarity. When Jason's attorney had requested mediation, thinking they could negotiate a settlement, I'd been ready. The mediation took place in a conference room at Patricia's firm. Jason sat across from me with his attorney, a man named Gerald who'd clearly been fed a very different story than the truth. Gerald had opened with his demands. My client is requesting 50% of the equity in the marital home, as is standard in divorce proceedings. Patricia had smiled, a cold, professional smile. The home in question is not marital property. It was purchased by my client 3 years before the marriage and is specifically protected under their prenuptial agreement. She'd slid a copy of the prenup across the table. Section 4, Paragraph 2. All property owned by either party prior to marriage shall remain separate property and shall not be subject to division in the event of divorce. Gerald had scanned the document, his expression changing as he read. Jason had shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Furthermore, Patricia had continued, my client has documentation showing sole financial responsibility for the property. Every mortgage payment, every tax payment, every expense related to the house has been paid exclusively from her accounts. She'd placed the organized financial breakdown on the table. Gerald had flipped through it, his jaw tightening. My client improved the property value, Jason had interjected. I did work on the house. Repairs, renovations. That should count for something. Patricia had pulled out another folder. Contractor invoices for all major work done on the property. All paid by my client from her account. If you're referring to minor repairs, my client is happy to compensate you for materials at cost. But equity? No. Gerald had asked for a recess. He'd needed to speak with his client privately. When they'd returned from the recess, Gerald's entire approach had changed. The bluster was gone. He'd looked tired. My client would like to revisit the equity claim in light of the prenuptial agreement, he'd started carefully. There's nothing to revisit, Patricia had said. The prenup is clear. The financial records are clear. Your client has no claim to the property. What about marital appreciation? The house has increased in value during the marriage. My client is entitled to half of that appreciation. Tricia had shaken her head. In this state, appreciation of separate property remains separate property unless marital funds were used for improvements. All improvements to this property were funded exclusively by my client. I'd watched Jason's face as his case crumbled. He'd forgotten about the prenup, or he'd convinced himself it wouldn't matter. He'd built his entire strategy on the assumption that marriage automatically meant shared property. He'd been wrong. "There's another matter," Patricia had said, her voice taking on an edge. "During discovery, we found evidence of attempted fraud." She'd placed the bank pre-qualification letter on the table. "Your client applied for a home equity line of credit, listing himself as the property owner." "That's fraud." Gerald had gone pale. "I wasn't aware of this." "We also have evidence of financial misconduct within the marriage." Patricia had added the bank transfer records to the pile. Unauthorized removal of funds from joint accounts. False statements to friends and family about my client's mental state. And text messages explicitly detailing his plan to intimidate my client into surrendering property rights. Gerald had looked at Jason with undisguised frustration. He'd clearly not been told any of this. "We need another recess," Gerald had said. The second recess lasted much longer. I'd sat in Patricia's office, sipping terrible coffee from her machine, while Jason and Gerald argued in the conference room next door. When they finally returned, Gerald looked like he'd aged 5 years. "The financial disclosure you requested revealed some complications," he'd said carefully. "My client has accumulated significant credit card debt, approximately $38,000. Patricia had raised her eyebrows. "I see. And this debt was incurred during the marriage?" "Yes. Over the past 2 years." I'd felt a cold shock of surprise. $38,000? I'd had no idea. "The debt is mostly luxury expenses," Gerald had continued. "Travel, electronics, dining out." My client had planned to consolidate this debt through refinancing the marital home. "The home that isn't marital property," Patricia had said flatly. "Yes. That's become clear." So that's what the whole refinancing push had been about. Jason hadn't just wanted his name on my house. He'd wanted to use my equity to pay off his secret debt. Debt he'd hidden from me while we were married. "Without access to the home's equity, my client is now exposed to this debt personally," Gerald had said. "We'd like to discuss potential assistance." Patricia had looked at me. I'd shaken my head. "My client is not responsible for your client's undisclosed personal debt," Patricia had said. "Particularly debt incurred through luxury spending while he was claiming financial hardship." Jason had slumped in his chair, all his confidence gone. Case went to court 2 weeks later. Jason had apparently decided to fight despite his attorney's advice to settle. He genuinely believed a judge would see things his way. He'd argued that he'd improved the property value through his labor and effort, that he'd been a partner in maintaining and upgrading the house. Patricia had calmly presented the contractor invoices. Every single one paid from my account. The new roof? Mine. Kitchen renovation? Mine. The landscaping? Mine. "What improvements did your client personally make?" the judge had asked Jason directly. "I painted the guest bedroom," Jason had said. "And I fixed the fence. And I did yard work." "Do you have receipts for materials?" "No, but..." "Did you pay for professional services?" "I did it myself, so you did minor maintenance and repairs, which is expected when living in a home," the judge had said. "That doesn't establish equity interest." Jason's attorney had tried a different angle. "Your Honor, my client relocated for this marriage. He gave up career opportunities. He's entitled to some compensation." "Your client relocated 4 years ago," the judge had said, scanning the documents. "Ms. Whitmore has provided evidence that your client is employed full-time at a salary of $75,000 annually. His career doesn't appear to have suffered." The judge had looked directly at Jason. "Do you dispute any of the financial documentation Ms. Whitmore has provided? The mortgage payment history, the tax payments, the maintenance expenses?" Jason had opened his mouth, then closed it. No, but... Then I see no basis for your claim to marital property. The prenuptial agreement is clear, and the financial record supports that the property has been maintained entirely at Ms. Whitmore's expense. The judge had paused, looking at more documents. There's also the matter of the fraudulent loan application. Mr. Whitmore, did you apply for a home equity line of credit using property you didn't own? Jason had gone pale. I thought as a married person I could. You listed yourself as the property owner. That's false information on a financial application. I'm ordering a full financial audit of both parties. The audit had taken 3 weeks. A forensic accountant had gone through everything: our personal accounts, our joint account, our credit cards, our tax returns. The results had been devastating for Jason. The auditor had discovered that Jason had overstated his income on not just the home equity application, but on a personal loan application he'd filed 6 months earlier. He'd claimed to have significant assets, specifically projected equity in his home. Equity that didn't exist because he didn't own the home. The auditor had also found that Jason had been using our joint checking account to pay his personal credit cards, the ones with the $38,000 in debt, without my knowledge. Small payments that I'd never noticed, but that added up over time. Your client has engaged in systematic financial misconduct, Patricia had told Gerald when the audit results came in. Fraudulent applications, misrepresentation of income and assets, unauthorized use of joint funds. This goes beyond divorce proceedings. This is potential criminal behavior. Gerald had looked sick. What are you asking for? Full settlement in my client's favor. Your client vacates the property within 30 days. He assumes all personal debt. He makes no claim to any marital assets. And we don't press charges for fraud. Gerald had looked at Jason. Take the deal. Jason's entire strategy had collapsed. The confidence, the intimidation tactics, the narrative he'd built, all of it evaporated in the face of actual documentation and legal scrutiny. His attorney had advised him to settle, to take what he could get and move on before things got worse. But Jason had tried one more play. He'd shown up at the house 3 days after the audit results came in, asking to speak to me privately. I'd let him in with my phone recording in my pocket just in case. Lauren, I know I messed up, he'd said, his voice earnest and apologetic. I panicked. I felt insecure living in your house, not having any ownership. I made bad decisions because I felt like I wasn't really part of this life we built together. We didn't build this together, I'd said quietly. I built this before I met you. You moved into something that was already established. I know. I see that now. I want to work things out. Can we try? Can we go to counseling, figure this out without lawyers? I'd looked at him, this man I'd married, who'd planned to intimidate me out of my own home, who'd committed fraud using my property, who'd told friends I was mentally unstable. No, I'd said. We're done. The settlement was finalized 2 weeks later. Terms were simple and non-negotiable. Jason would vacate the property within 30 days. He would assume full responsibility for his personal debt, all $38,000 of it. He would make no claim to any equity in the house or any other marital assets beyond his personal belongings. In exchange, I wouldn't press charges for the fraudulent loan applications or pursue legal action for the misuse of joint funds. He'd signed the agreement. He'd had no choice. Moving day had been surreal. I'd watched from the kitchen window as movers carried out Jason's furniture, his clothes, his electronics. Things that had filled this house for 4 years, now leaving as if they'd never been here. Jason had walked through the rooms one last time, touching the walls like they'd personally betrayed him. I think he genuinely believed his plan would work. That intimidation and confidence would somehow override legal ownership. That calling the police would scare me into submission. He truly thought he could take my house just by saying it was his. The locks were changed that afternoon before the sun set. I'd hired a locksmith to install new deadbolts, new door handles, new everything. Jason's keys no longer worked on any door in this house. Over the following weeks, the social dynamics shifted. Friends who'd heard Jason's version of events started learning the truth. Nathan had shared some of Jason's more damning text messages with mutual friends. Others had asked me directly what happened, and I'd calmly explained. The house was mine before marriage. Jason had tried to claim it wasn't. The courts disagreed. I didn't share the details about the fraud or the debt unless specifically asked. I didn't need to destroy Jason's reputation. He'd done that himself. Documentation had circulated quietly through our social circle. Truth had a way of spreading once people knew where to look. Jason had stopped attending mutual gatherings, stopped showing up at the gym we both went to, stopped frequenting the restaurants we used to visit together. His narrative had collapsed under the weight of actual facts. 3 months after the divorce was finalized, I'd received one final text from him. Just 6 words. "Can we talk about the house?" I'd stared at that text for a long time before responding. Part of me wanted to ignore it completely, but curiosity got the better of me. "What about the house?" I texted back. "Would you consider selling it to me? At a fair market rate. I could get a mortgage, do it properly this time." I'd actually laughed out loud reading that. Jason wanted to buy my house. The house he'd tried to steal through intimidation and fraud. Now he wanted me to sell it to him. "No," I texted back simply. "I could offer above market value. I really love this place." "No." "Lauren, please. I made mistakes, but I still feel connected to this home." I blocked his number after that. I didn't need to explain to him that he'd forever ruined any chance of me trusting him with anything, let alone something as significant as my home. Instead, I'd called a landscaping company and scheduled the renovation I'd been postponing for years. New garden beds, a stone pathway, updated outdoor lighting. All the things I'd wanted to do but had put off. The house felt lighter somehow, like it was breathing easier without Jason's presence weighing it down. A year after Jason moved out, I was sitting on my newly renovated patio, morning coffee in hand, watching birds gather at the feeder I'd installed. The property value had increased significantly, the neighborhood was becoming more desirable, and my updates had only enhanced the appeal. My mortgage was nearly paid off. Everything was exactly as it should be. I'd heard through mutual friends that Jason was renting a small apartment across town. He'd had to declare bankruptcy to deal with his debt. His credit was destroyed. He'd tried to take my house, thinking he could bully his way into ownership. And instead, he'd lost everything: the marriage, his financial stability, his social standing. I'd won by simply holding on to what was already mine. Sometimes people asked me if I regretted being so harsh in the divorce, if I felt bad about how things turned out for Jason. The answer was always no. Jason had made calculated decisions. He'd planned to intimidate me. He'd committed fraud. He'd tried to manipulate our friends into thinking I was unstable. He'd hidden massive debt while living in my house and pushing me to put his name on my property so he could pay off that debt with my equity. Every consequence he faced was a direct result of his own choices. I'd simply refused to be a victim of those choices. I documented everything. I protected myself legally. I'd let him make his moves, and then I'd countered with actual facts and evidence. When he called the police to kick me out of my own home, I'd let him. I'd let him make that call, let him smirk and feel confident, let him think he was winning. And then I'd watched his face drop when the officers asked to see the deed. 2 years after the divorce, I met someone new. Someone who respected boundaries, who didn't see my financial independence as a challenge or a threat. On our 3rd date, he'd asked about my house, the beautiful Tudor I'd mentioned buying years ago. "I bought it 7 years ago," I'd said, "before my previous marriage. It's one of my favorite things about my life." "That's impressive," he'd said genuinely. "Owning your own home that young. You must be proud." I am, I'd said. And I meant it. I never told him about Jason's attempt to take it, about the police call or the fraud or the court case. That was the past, handled and resolved. This house was mine. It had always been mine. And when Jason had tried to claim otherwise, I'd let the truth speak for itself. I didn't yell or beg or retaliate recklessly. I kept the deed. I kept the records. I kept the receipts. And I kept my home. Jason had thought confidence would replace paperwork. He'd thought intimidation would override legal ownership. He'd thought calling the police would force me out. So I'd let him call them. I'd let him feel powerful and in control right up until the moment the officers asked for documentation. And I'd watched his face drop when authorities sided with the truth. Quiet strength. Legal precision. Earned justice. The house stood exactly as it had before Jason entered my life. Strong, solid mine. And I sat on my patio, coffee in hand, watching the morning sun illuminate the garden I'd finally finished, in the home I'd always protected. Exactly where I belonged.